Olá, alunos da disciplina de Design de Materiais. Nessa aula eu vou resumir o capítulo 10 do livro que a gente tem usado para trabalhar, que é o Graves, Design and Assessment Plan. Esse é o capítulo 10, né? E o livro Designing Language Courses I Got for Teachers. Well, what are the roles of assessing students, assessing the course itself? So there are three roles for assessment: assessing needs, what and how do students need to learn; assessing students' learning, what have students learned; evaluating the course itself, how effective is or was the course in helping them learn. Assessing the course gives you direction to make decisions and replan the course. When you assess your students' needs, usually you do that in the beginning of a course to plan your course. So if you assess their needs and you see that, for example, they need to learn, simply speaking, business English, so you're going to plan your course to teach business English. In my case, I just remembered a case that I had a student who was going to present a seminar in an event, academic event in the United States. So the only thing we did in class was rehearsal. So he rehearsed the seminar many times, and I watched him present, and I corrected pronunciation, and I just taught him English to present his seminar in the United States. So the need was to present a seminar in the United States. And how I planned my course, it was just, I planned the course to help the student to do a good presentation, a good oral presentation. And then how you assess the student's learning is something you do during the course, right? So there are three roles for assessment: assessing their needs, their learning, and even assessing your course to replan the course. There are two types of assessment. I think I studied that last year: formative and summative. Formative is a type of assessment that is progressive. It's ongoing. For example, when you write your senior paper and your professor corrects and gives you back the paper for you to work more on it, this is a type of formative assessment. So that you improve your writing, you add some more ideas, and then you improve you correct your grammar mistakes. This is a type of formative assessment. Or when we teachers ask you to redo some compositions. So for example, we ask you to do a composition and you do a writing, and then you give this to your teacher corrects and asks you to do a second version. That's also a type of formative because it's progressive. You can work on your own mistakes and have a better grade in the end. A summative assessment is the type you do like one test at the end of the course, for example, and it's cumulative. You have to, teachers are evaluating your cumulative knowledge, the knowledge you have accumulated during the course. That's a summative assessment. One example is Enem summative. Vestibular summative. What is assessed? So here I have the transcription of a paragraph from the book. I'm going to read it to you. Graves says, if you're teaching a speaking and listening course whose objectives include being able to speak in real-world situations, then your assessment plan will include ways to assess students' ability to speak in those situations. For example, a group of business people who are learning how to participate in meetings in the target language will be assessed on that ability. A group of people who plan to use a target language in tourist settings will be assessed accordingly. If you're teaching a content-based history course for high school students whose objectives include the ability to read and analyze history texts, as well as the development of strategies to do so, then your assessment plan will include ways to assess your students' development of strategies, as well as their reading and analytical skills. In other words, the author says that, of course, what you assess is what you have to teach, and what you have to teach has to be in accordance with a student's needs. So, as she says here, you're teaching a group of business people and they have to learn how to participate in a meeting, so you're going to assess their ability to participate in a meeting, and that will include, of course, the 4 skills if necessary. Oh, speaking of the 4 skills, if you're teaching a student reading strategies only to do an English test that involves only reading, then you have to assess the student's ability to read, but not necessarily the student's ability to speak. This happened to me in the past. I had a student who had to do those tests of English, which is like this. You have only a text in English, and then it's reading comprehension, and then you have to answer in Portuguese to make sure that you understood the text. I don't know if it's still if they still do that, but this was a normal test for masters, for you to go to a master's program. In a master's program, the idea is, do you know how to read in English? Because you're going to have a lot of papers to read in English. Can you do that? So that's why, besides all the application process to be in the master's program, you needed to do this English test, which was done in Portuguese. A ideia é, você sabe ler em inglês? Você consegue interpretar um texto em inglês para estar no mestrado? So this type of test was text is in English, answers in Portuguese. So in this case, I didn't have to assess my students' ability of writing correctly. I didn't have to assess, for example, grammar. I didn't have to assess pronunciation. I didn't have to teach that, and I didn't have to assess that. Well, I have to teach some grammar because it's involved in the text, but I didn't have to assess that. I had to assess only the student's ability to read and interpret a text. So you're going to assess according to the student's need. What are the criteria to evaluate? Well, if the evaluation criterion is an effective business presentation, for example, what does effective mean? Students need to know the criteria and also how to meet the criteria. Without criteria, there are no guidelines to assess. So, of course, effective has different meanings for different levels. Think about a basic student and an advanced student. Of course, effective is going to mean different things. So, if your teaching plan is clear, then your evaluation criteria will be clear too. I mean, you know which level of proficiency the students have to achieve. Of course, a basic student who got a 10, a perfect 10, is a 10 according to the basic level. Of course, he's not proficient. Of course, he will make mistakes, but you're giving a grade according to the level of the students, right? So what does effective mean? What does effective communication mean for each level, for each objective? Well, why do you assess students' learning? Yes, there's this idea, why do you have to assess people? Why do you have to assess students? Yeah, it's complicated. I know it's complicated. It's not a straightforward issue. Like we have to assess usually because of institutional obligations. Like for example, UNIMEP, we have to have at least one grade, and it has to include something written. And this is institutional. I mean, grades are part of our society, but we know that some societies do not assess their students. And I totally agree that assessment is sometimes unfair, totally unfair. The problem is that we are inside a society that has some rules and institutions that have rules, and then we have to follow these rules, although they're not perfect. And this, we could discuss this next class, because only speaking here to the screen of my computer, it's not very fun. But I'd like to discuss this with you, because I'm sure you know that some societies think that we should not assess students because this is unfair. So this is something that we could discuss. It's not something we have an answer to. It's complicated. But here, why do we assess students' learning? Well, to assess their proficiency, you can do a pre-course test to place the students appropriately. So you know those, when you go to a language school, there are those placement tests, so that you know where the students are going to be placed. Basic, high intermediate, low intermediate, advanced. So this is why we need to take a test. In a post-course assessment may be done to assess achievement. And why? Well, we live in a society that, I mean, you may have to do a TOEFL test. You may have to do a test to get a job, to get a job, and so on. Well, another reason is diagnosing ability and needs. You can do a pre or during course test in order to identify and meet students' needs. And you could assess their progress during course and assess their achievement at the end of the course or unit in order to assess what has been learned and or assign a grade. And then you assess what has been learned to plan the next steps. Right, if you have to do a review, for example. So sometimes you assess students not only to assign them a grade, but to plan your next steps. So there are many reasons why you assess. Sometimes it's unfair. You assess students because you just need a grade because your institution asks you to give them a grade. Or sometimes you assess students because you have to understand what the next steps are. What to assess? Here I bring some examples that Graves brings, but some other examples to compare. Well, assessing writing skills, what to assess? Here there is A and B, what to assess, and I wrote writing and speaking. A is writing, B is speaking. But of course you could assess listening skills too, reading skills in different ways. But here I brought some examples of what to assess, how to assess writing and speaking. Writing, I bring two examples in ENA and TOEFL. They're not in the book, they're my examples, because they're very similar to what Graves discusses. TOEFL, for example, has descriptive bands. Graves brings some examples of descriptive bands, and TOEFL is a perfect example of a descriptive band. What is that? I took these examples from the website ETS, that applies the TOEFL test, and it says, for the advanced level, what's being assessed? It says there, test takers who score at an advanced level typically can Produce clear, well-developed, and well-organized text. Ungrammatical, unclear, or unidiomatic use of English is rare. So mistakes like grammar, language mistakes is rare. Express an opinion on a controversial issue and support that opinion with appropriate details and explanations in writing, demonstrating variety and range of vocabulary and grammatical structures. Select important information from multiple sources, integrated and presented coherently and clearly in writing, with only occasional minor imprecision in the summary of the source information. So this is a descriptive band for an advanced level. Some mistakes are okay, but generally the text will be detailed, vocabulary will be varied, and the test takers are able to discuss the ideas clearly. And then there is a band for low intermediate, high intermediate, and basic. I bring here only the basic, the other two I didn't bring because it was just too much information. But what is a basic composition, TOEFL composition? Test takers who score at the basic level typically can produce some text that is related to the topic, but with little detail and or lack of organization. Convey information from the sources or some ideas on an issue, but grammatical errors, unclear expressions, and or poor sentence structure make their writing difficult to comprehend. So this is a basic level for test takers. So the people who are evaluating these writings, they take into consideration these bands here. What is an advanced? So they see if the writing meets these descriptions, and then they decide if it's basic, low intermediate, high intermediate, advanced. It's not very clear because sometimes, for example, there are no grammar mistakes at all, but a text is very basic because the vocabulary is repetitive, and then ideas are not very well organized. So that would be, for example, low intermediate. So it's not very clear. Sometimes it's not very clear if it's basic, low intermediate, because people who evaluate have to make decisions. And then I bring the example of NA. NA evaluates, people who evaluate that take into consideration the 5 competencies. Each competence is rated 0 or 1 to 5. Competence 1 is grammar and goes from 0 to 5. And it's more like this. Sometimes you have to count how many mistakes there are in the writing. If there are up to 2 mistakes, that's a 5. If there are 3 mistakes, then it's a 4. It's not a 5 anymore. And then there are many guidelines for people who take into consideration when they are evaluating. There's a training for that, a very serious training, so that everyone is in the same page when they are evaluating a composition. So if one how do you call that? Avaliador, corretor, avaliador do Enem. Se um avaliador avaliar uma redação como sendo, por exemplo, nota máxima, outros têm que vai ser avaliado por outras pessoas também, acho que 1 ou 2 a mais, e tem que dar a mesma nota. Se tiver alguma diferença, aí vai para um outro avaliador, pode até ir para supervisão se as diferenças forem muito grandes. Então é um treinamento bem sério mesmo para todo mundo estar na mesma sintonia. Competence number 2 is textual type. The evaluation from 1 to 5, grades 1 to 5. Zero is not possible, because if it's zero, then the writing is how to say it, the grade is zero, é zero por fuga, não atendimento ao tipo textual, né? Se não for do tipo textual que é para ser discursivo, né? Então, se for zero na competência 2, aí a redação zero por completo. Por isso que a competência 2 é de 1 a 5 e todas as outras competências é de 0 a 5. Então, competência 2 é textual type. It has to be dissertative. And then competence 3 is cohesion and organization of ideas. You also have to evaluate according to if the ideas are correctly related. Competence 4, it's a test taker's repertoire and knowledge. If the student brings information, if the student brings information, that's the idea, you know. If the student has a good knowledge on the topic. Competence 5 is solution to a problem. É o famoso intervenção, né? A intervenção, qual é a solução para o problema? Então, se é violência doméstica, por exemplo, qual seria a solução? Então, você coloca uma intervenção. So, so you have to evaluate each competence from 1 to 5 or from 0 to 5. And then you have a final grade that takes into account if grammar is perfect, for example, perfect. But then the knowledge that that a test taker brings is not very broad. You know, it's too little, or some knowledge, some information that is not correct. Then competence 4 will have an average grade, and competence 1 will have a very good grade. So these grades, they are crossed from one competence to another. Quer dizer, pode ter nenhuma competência uma nota muito boa, na outra uma nota mais ou menos, e isso vai dar a média final. And then, the example that Graves brings is similar to TOEFL and NA. He brings an example like this. You have in a writing, in a composition by a student, introduction and thesis statement, and then you as a teacher will evaluate if it's poor, fair, good, very good, or excellent. That's kind of 1 to 5, right? And then topic sentences and supporting details. Poor, fair, good, very good, or excellent. Logical sequencing, connection of ideas and information, cohesion. Poor, fair, good, very good, excellent. Conclusion. Poor, fair, good, very good, or excellent. So you're going to evaluate the writing in parts, you know, the introduction, the development, and the conclusion. Each part of the evaluation is going to have a grade from 1 to 5, you know, a poor, fair, good, very good, or excellent. That's very similar to a name, right? So this is one idea for us to evaluate the writing of our students. Another example of assessing is the use of correction codes for feedback. I used to use that when I used to teach the English language, but I haven't taught English. I've been teaching some other courses, you know, so I'm not using correction codes for TCC, you know, for senior paper. I don't do that because we need to save some time. But for English, you know, English language, then correction codes, I think it's a great idea. Students reflect on the codes and try to correct the mistakes themselves. Examples. WO means wrong order. SP means spelling. VT, verb tense. V, vocabulary. So if the student wrote, I lost the bus, you underline lost, and you write a V. The problem is vocabulary, because then the student is going to think, okay, I lost the bus. Oops. I lost the bus. And then V, okay, there is a problem with vocabulary. What's the problem here? So the student has to do some research, you know, to find the solution for the problem. Ask somebody else if he doesn't know. But the problem here is I missed the bus, not I lost. I work here for 4 years, and then you underline the verb and you write VT, verb tense. Remember that when the focus is on a period of time, you use present perfect or present perfect continuous. So the student has to remember that, or try to, ask someone, I've worked here, or I've been working here for 4 years. It was introduced a new teaching method, wrong order, and then the student has to redo the sentence. A new teaching method was introduced, so the order of the sentence was wrong. And then when the student sees these correction codes and they have to work on their own mistakes, I believe this is very effective for learning. You're not evaluating, giving them a grade. You're evaluating for them to work on their own mistakes and then correct these mistakes. I think it's very effective. Well, letter A was assessing writing, and letter B here assessing speaking activities. These are some examples that I brought from the book. So she brings this table for a class assessment plan: what, how, and % of grade. So she gives an example of a teacher who's going to evaluate attendance. How, daily count, if you're present every day, and the % is 20%. Participation, 4 observation each, 20%. Coursework, and then she says, okay, text, classwork, with how, 1 student made quiz. I think it's an activity that the student was supposed to do. 15%. A project, how, task or group presentations, 15%. Conversation skills, how, oral assessment, 10%. So this is a summary, but then you would have, if you're a teacher using this, you would have to discuss with your students more details about it. But this is one example of a class assessment plan. You have some activities that are going to be graded, how much you're going to grade, what is the % of grade, and how you're going to grade. Another example is a role play assessment. In the book, Graves says role play, but I think it's good for seminars too. So she says, grade 0 would be, well, there are three aspects to evaluate: pronunciation, presentation, and content. So a student who gets a 0 fails to communicate for pronunciation, presentation, and content. A grade 1 is like this: pronunciation, barely comprehensible; presentation, no eye contact, inaudible sometimes, uses some English, which means that maybe using native language. Content, some incomplete and or inaccurate information, repetitive vocabulary. A grade 2 student would be like this: pronunciation, sometimes exhibits adequate pronunciation; presentation, minimal eye contact, voice is monotone; content, adequate information, little variety of vocabulary. A grade 3 student would be pronunciation, correct pronunciation most of the times; presentation, occasional eye contact, adequate voice tone and volume; and content, appropriate information, variety of vocabulary most of the times. And finally, a grade 4 would be pronunciation, consistently accurate pronunciation; presentation, consistently makes eye contact, effective use of voice tone and volume; and content, precise, detailed, accurate information, wide variety of vocabulary. Well, these tables, I read these tables for you, they were in the original book, but these tables are examples of how to assess oral presentations, oral activities, because it's very subjective. Guys, it's very difficult, because sometimes, for example, we see that the students made mistakes, but the communication was effective. So you have to evaluate the effectiveness of communication, but also the mistakes. So you have to decide which one is more important. And which one is more important? Well, for a communicative course, communication is more important than grammar. So even if the student makes grammar mistakes but communicates well, then the grade will be, a good one, not a perfect one, but a good one. But if the student does not communicate well, that's the problem. That's where the grades are low. That's why it's so, evaluation is something very difficult, very subjective and very difficult. Although we try to be objective, believe me, we try, we give numbers, and then tries to be very, very objective. The training is very, very serious. We have to take the training very seriously because we need to be objective when we are evaluating, and only good criteria can make this more objective. If you do not have good criteria to evaluate, then your evaluation will be more subjective. Well, now I took this paragraph from the book because it summarizes everything, and she says, to summarize, your assessment plan should allow you to assess students' needs, to assess their learning, and to evaluate the effectiveness of the course. It should include formative assessment activities so that you can adjust the course as you teach it, and provide summative information so that you can look back retrospectively in order to redesign it. Your assessment plan will reflect the uniqueness of your institutional and social-cultural context, your students, and your beliefs and understandings about language, learning, and teaching. Yes, guys, it's also about your beliefs, because again, if you believe, for example, that, let's say, grammar is very, very important, you're going to use grammar as something, for example, a high percentage for grammar because you believe grammar is very important. But if you don't believe it's important, then the percentage to evaluate grammar could be lower. This is a very simple example, okay? I'm just saying that your beliefs and your society, the social cultural context, everything will determine your evaluation process, your evaluation plan. Well, and an activity for next class. Think of a course you have taught lately. List the ways in which you assess the student's learning. Why did you choose those ways? Was the evaluation formative or summative? Did you think they were effective? Why or why not? If you have not taught a course, then think of a course in which you were a learner or observer. In what ways was learning assessed? Did you think they were effective? Why or why not? And also, was the evaluation formative or summative? Or both, okay? Could be both. We do that. We do both at UNIMEP. You're gonna jot down some ideas to discuss them online next Monday, which is June 1st. Okay, so the activity is just for you to take notes, to reflect on your own experience as teacher or as learners, your own experience related to evaluations. Okay, let's focus on English, right? But you can think of other courses at UNIMEP too. But let's focus on evaluating the English language, okay? Performance in the English language. Well, that's it. So I see you next Monday online at Collaborate platform, okay? And next class is going to be more like a conversation. It's going to be a debate. See you then.